Training to failure, one of the most debated topics in bodybuilding. Naturals need to avoid it at all costs, and enhanced bodybuilders, they can pile on failure training. Get up the next day and do it over and over again with no consequences. At least that might be what you think if you believe everything you read on the internet. Yet, I'm here today as a bodybuilding coach and somebody that's been doing this for 20 plus years. That couldn't be more further from the truth. So that's exactly what we're gonna break down in this video today. If you wanna maximize your gains without overtraining, and you wanna use an approach that's backed both by science and tried and true methods that have stood the test of time, let's go over exactly what you need to be doing, when, how, or even if you should be training to failure. So first off, let's define what does training to failure actually mean. 90% of people I talk to, or even 99%, have this incorrect. Their perception of what the term failure training actually means is not in line with what it actually is. Most people confuse failure training with training with 0 reps in reserve. Now, they might sound the same, but I promise you, these are very different when it comes to increasing muscular size. Not only that, but the type of systemic fatigue that can set in from this type of training. Now, momentary muscular failure, in simple terms, that means that when you're performing a set, at any point in that set, you get to a rep that you can no longer complete due to the fact that you've recruited and exhausted all available muscle fibers. Let's use the bench press for example, as this is one of the most common exercises I see people fail on. Let's say you do your 10 rep max, meaning that the maximum amount of repetitions you can perform with this specific weight is 10 reps, no more. But what happens if you go for an 11th rep? You might either completely fail to get the bar off your chest on rep 11, needing a spotter to take it off for you, or you might get to a sticking point in the rep somewhere in the middle. You might get that first half of the rep, but then the bar comes to a screeching halt. And if you don't have a spotter to assist that rep, that bar is coming straight back down. Now, that specific point in the lift where you could no longer lift the bar, that is where you reach momentary muscular failure. But here's the point of failure that you need to understand and to know if you truly hit failure in a set. If you truly hit failure, that means that at some point you've failed to complete another rep. Now, if you did not fail to miss a rep or fail to complete a rep on your own without a spotter, you did not hit failure. And likely, you're still training very hard, but you're not missing reps. Therefore, you're not actually training to failure, but doing something that many people confuse with the term failure training, and that is training with 0 reps in reserve. Let's use that same bench press example. Take that same weight, that same 10 rep max. On rep number 9, you effectively have 1 more rep left in the tank. If you perform that 10th rep, which is your absolute max, that last rep, it's gonna be a real grinder. You lock it out, you rack it, and you know there's no physical way that you'd be able to complete another rep under any circumstances. After you completed that set, you left 0 reps in the tank. But keep in mind, you did not fail under that load. You didn't fail because you didn't attempt an 11th rep. This would be training to 0 reps in reserve. You didn't leave any reps in the tank, but you also didn't fail on a rep. That means you did not train to failure. This is a very small but very significant difference between training with 0 reps in reserve and training to failure. And in my experience, 99% of people throw around the phrase, take this set to failure, and use it incorrectly. What they really mean is 0 reps in reserve. All right, so now that we understand the differences here, let's talk about the pros and cons of each. Let's talk about which you should use, if any. If your goal is to maximize muscle growth in the gym, you need to understand the concept of effective reps, which in simple terms, that means the last few reps in a set leading up to 0 reps in reserve. These reps are the most effective for building muscle. It's pretty much agreed upon in science that the last 5 reps in a set leading up to 0 reps in reserve are the most effective for building muscle. That means that, let's say you're using that same 10 rep max on your bench press, the first 5 reps of the set, they're really not building any muscle. But reps 6 through 10, those are the growth reps. And every single rep you perform from 6 to 10 will be more stimulating than the rep prior. That means that on rep 6, you're gonna get some muscle growth. On rep 7, you're gonna get a bit more. On rep 8, that's when you're gonna start really tapping into muscle growth. Rep 9, that's really gonna be where you're producing the most muscle growth out of any rep in the set. And number 10 is likely just as effective as rep number 9. And if your goal is to get the most out of one set, rep 10 can definitely be worth doing. But there will be a potential drawback to doing that 10th rep, which we're gonna talk about in a minute. And just a side note here, The last 5 reps in a set could be within any rep range, even if you're only doing a set of 5. That just means that every rep is an effective rep if it's your 5 rep max. And this is why generally anything less than a 5 rep set is considered not ideal in bodybuilding training. Not useless, but definitely not ideal. But keep in mind here, also the more advanced that you become, the more the window for effective reps closes. As a beginner, training with even 5 reps in reserve, that can produce significant levels of muscle growth. But the more advanced you become, the closer you'll need to push to 0 reps in reserve, if you even want to see any muscle growth. Now, for someone like me, at this stage of training, after 20 plus years, basically anything more than 2 reps left in the tank, that's pretty much junk volume. That means for me, on that same set of 10, the reps that build muscle are really only reps 8, 9, and 10. And depending on your training, you can even make a case for saying that only reps 9 and 10 are effective. But regardless of where you are, even with the benefits of training closer to 0 reps in reserve, there are definitely some drawbacks. And even more drawbacks when it comes to training to absolute failure, or failing to complete another rep. The closer you push any set to failure, the greater the stimulus will be, but also the greater the fatigue will be. And if you want to grow, you not only have to stimulate muscle growth, but you have to recover from that stimulus so that you can do it over again and again. This is why you see most guys that train with a higher volume or higher frequency, they're generally performing most sets shy of failure, with 1 to 2 reps left in the tank, sometimes even more. Think of the bodybuilders that you know that do lots of pump training, lots of high volume training. They're also in the gym very frequently, and that's simply because most of the sets they perform are not very demanding, but they're also not stimulating a ton of muscle growth set per set. That's why they have to do so many of them. Now compare that to guys that train strictly high intensity style, low volume. Most of these guys are never leaving any reps in the tank, and they're often training to failure and sometimes beyond failure. With this style of training, you likely won't see many sets performed. And many of these guys are often in the gym much less. More rest days per week are needed here because although you're getting a ton out of each individual set, they're also redlining their recovery ability with how hard they're pushing each set. And without rest days between, they won't recover in time for the next training session to be productive. And then if you have guys who are consistently training to failure, which again, most people aren't, and they're actually training to 0 reps in reserve, that's when you have guys like Menser who recommend multiple days off in between each session in the gym. If you're really training with that kind of intensity and expecting to do anything productive the next day, that's just wishful thinking. Now that we understand the benefits and the drawbacks to training to 0 reps in reserve, failure, or leaving reps in the tank, let's talk about when you should use each of these. First, let's talk about exercises. Many guys will talk about always training to failure with every exercise and every session in the gym. But the fact is, when you should train to failure, if at all, it's going to depend on the exercise heavily. Big compound lifts, think barbell presses, overhead presses, squats, deadlifts, rows. These exercises are always very demanding on the nervous system. So training these exercises to 0 reps in reserve is going to create an even bigger inroads to your recovery ability than doing so on something like curls. And training to failure, it's not even advisable on these movements, simply due to safety concerns. Failing on something like a barbell squat, it's not only not going to produce any additional effective reps from building muscle, but you also run the risk of altering your technique just to get out of the hole. You're greatly increasing your chance of injury, and you're getting 0 additional benefits from muscle growth. Not to mention, you're also frying your recovery ability for 0 additional benefits. Big, heavy compound lifts with a barbell, they're very technical. These are movements that you have to be aware of form breakdown as you approach failure. And the max benefit that you can get out of these sets are really 0 reps in reserve. But even doing that, you must do them with a spotter for safety. And if you're not an extremely advanced lifter, you're most likely still getting all of the benefits out of the movement with less inroads to recovery by training with even 1 or 2 reps left in the tank. If you're more advanced and you want to spend more time training to 1 to 0 reps left in the tank on these movements, if you're intermediate, it should be 1 to 2 reps left in the tank. And if you're a beginner, 2 to 3 reps is probably plenty. But that doesn't mean never approach failure on these sets. Over time, your goal is to progress in weight on the bar or additional reps. As a natural result of this, over time, you're gonna find your limit. This is part of the process, and even if you intend to go 0 reps in reserve, you will occasionally fail to complete a lift. Doing this from time to time is a natural part of training, and it's not gonna set you back. But purposely training to failure in these lifts, especially on a regular basis, that's a great way to not only see your progress go down, but to find yourself extremely beat up, and that extra fatigue over time setting you up for injury risk. One thing that most people don't understand about injuries in the gym, majority of the time, they're not only just coming from poor technique, they're coming from systemic fatigue and improper programming. So treat your heavy compound lifts with respect. avoid purposely failing these lifts. But let's talk about isolation exercises and even some machines. Let's say you're performing a tricep press down on a cable. You can push these sets to 0 reps in reserve with very little difference in fatigue and recovery than even a few reps shy of failure. An isolation movement, it's just not that systemically demanding. And it's also a movement that you just don't have to worry about a high degree of injury risk. You're literally just extending your elbow under the load of a cable. That's it. So to maximize muscle growth, there's really not much of a drawback to pushing these sets. And if you're an advanced lifter, pushing these to 0 reps in reserve is likely needed to maximize growth. But as an intermediate or beginner, you can still do so without so much recovery demand. But just understand that in your case, you're likely going to get all the benefits still training just 1 to 2 reps shy of failure here. Should you train to failure in isolations, as in missing a rep? My stance on this is that there's really never a time or a benefit for going for an additional rep that you're not going to complete. And there's only drawbacks. But on something like an isolation movement, the drawbacks are much lower. So if you end up just taking a set to the point where you can no longer contract the muscle under a load on an isolation exercise, it's not really a bad thing. But understand that you're not building any additional muscle from those reps that you miss. Let's talk about one more factor here about when you should train to failure. When you should do 0 reps left in the tank or leave reps in reserve. The more frequently you train a body part and the more training sessions you perform per week, the more that you're going to want to shy away from failure. Even if, let's say, you're training the bench press, which is a highly technical movement. If you train with, let's say, 2 or more reps in reserve, your nervous system and muscles themselves, they can recover fairly quickly from the training session, and you can perform it again in just a few days. If you ever look at the higher frequency training that weightlifters and powerlifters use, they're very rarely training near failure because their goal is to perform that lift multiple times per week to build up their skill. They're purposely avoiding failure so that they can bench 2, 3, or even 4 times per week. If they were pushing those sets very hard, it would likely have to back off the frequency as a result. But if your goal is to gain muscle, and with that in mind, sets trained closer to failure is going to be more beneficial for you. But that doesn't mean to failure. But you also don't want to purposely hold yourself back. So if your training program calls for a higher frequency or more sets in each workout, understand that the more you're going to have to leave some reps left in the tank. And if you're training with very low volume or training very infrequently, understand that in order to maximize growth, you're gonna have to push those sets very hard. So let's talk about how to incorporate failure training, reps in reserve, and 0 reps left in the tank in your training without causing overtraining or injury. Here's my general rule of thumb, but keep in mind that there are plenty of outliers that will break these rules and still see great results. But this has always worked well for the majority of people I train. 1, if you're training a muscle group twice per week, most sets should be performed with roughly 1 to 2 reps left in the tank. Only about half or the final sets of each exercise should be trained to 0 reps in the tank. 2nd, if you're training a muscle group once per week, or you have up to, let's say, 5 to 7 days of recovery time, the majority of your sets can and most likely should be to 1 to 0 reps in reserve. 3, if you're training with more than 10 working sets for a muscle group in one single session, majority of those sets should be performed roughly 1 to 2 reps left in the tank and shy of failure. Now, if you're training with less than 6 sets per muscle group in one single session, majority of those sets should be taken to 0 reps in reserve, simply due to the fact that the volume is lower and you need more intensity to create a greater stimulus. And last one, if you're coming up on a deload or you're at the end of a training block, you can push the majority of those sets to 0 reps in reserve. And you can flirt with training to failure if your goal is to test your strength. You already have a planned deload after, and if you don't, you'll definitely need one once you really build up that fatigue from failure training. And before we wrap this up, let's talk about a couple myths about failure training. First one is failure is essential for growth. I think most people already understand that this one is false. Like I mentioned, the closer you push each set towards failure, the more each rep is stimulating growth. But actually hitting failure does nothing additional for muscle growth, and it only negatively impacts your recovery. Now, lots of guys who follow low volume training or even are on the HIIT bandwagon, they'll always talk about how they train to failure. But again, the majority of them are training with 0 reps in reserve and calling it failure. There's a lot of application for 0 reps in reserve, but very little for purposely training to failure. Another myth is that reps in reserve is light or even easy training. If we're talking about 5 or more reps from failure, then yes, that's easy. But if I tell someone to leave 1 to 2 reps left in the tank and they really push that set to 1 to 2 RAR, that's a hard set. Think about this. If you can squat 405 pounds for 10 reps, and that's your 10 rep max, reps 8 and 9, those are still grinders. So if you're currently leaving only 1 to 2 reps left in the tank on big compound movements, and you think it's easy, I guarantee you, you're not leaving 1 to 2 reps left in the tank you're probably leaving 4, 5, or even more. So let's wrap this up. If your goal is to maximize muscle growth, avoid purposely training to failure. Incorporate 0 reps in reserve sparingly. The lower your training volume or the frequency, the more you can incorporate them. Incorporate 1 to 2 reps in reserve for the majority of your sets, especially the higher your volume and the higher your frequency. And if you're a complete beginner or even an intermediate, get all the benefits that you can by staying even further from failure. Only really start to push those sets when you absolutely need it to continue growing. Apply this strategy to your training now and watch your muscle gains and strength gains skyrocket. And if you're ready to build more muscle, I've got something big coming your way. The Old School Mass Gain Group Coaching Community. In this program, you'll get access to my most advanced training system, a diet template that's customized to your goals. You'll get live weekly Q&A sessions with me. We'll go over deep dive coaching and questions and answers. You'll get access to a full community of like-minded lifters, all working towards the same goal. I'm opening it soon, and the first few to join will get an exclusive discount. If you're interested in early access, drop your email at the link below. You'll receive a free PDF, and you'll be the first to be notified as soon as it goes live. And if you want to see more of the best original bodybuilding content just like this, make sure to hit subscribe.